everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on advance in Nikola Tesla technologies. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Smith, Mr. Markley, and Mr. David J. Kelly. First, I would like to request Mr. David Smith.
Well, Sharif, thank you so much for this program today. Tesla was one of the leading inventors of our time and has had inventions that have had profound impact on all of humanity. Uh, and he was actually born back in 1856 and died in 1943. So many of his inventions he had were actually ahead of his time, and he influenced many other inventors like Edison and others who uh, actually went and learned from what he did and he did before. Um, it was really interesting in that his family, going back, his father was a priest and his mother was unschooled. And they really, though, prepared him well for when he was growing up and learning stuff. And he went to school in Europe, in Prague, in Budapest, and in Paris, but he left and came to the United States in 1884, really broke, and began to work for others like Thomas Edison and Westinghouse and others who his inventions really excelled at. Uh, he really became a math and physics genius and really contributed to a lot that impact our lives today. Um, as an inventor, he held over 300 patents. Uh, and really many of his ideas were tested and never became real well known. Or, his first job really was looking in take building DC power plants for Comet Edison, and it really set him off his going. Some of his inventions included alternating current, which is the basis of most of the power systems in the world today, the Tesla coil, magnifying transmitters, a Tesla turbine, shadowgraphs, radios, neon lights. He really pioneered the concept behind hydroelectric power, the induction motor, uh, many others. I mean, things like radio control boats, and beginning to put in place ideas that many other people have used to develop a lot of products today. Um, his innovation process was really fantastic and very good, and has been tried to be duplicated at many places, and began to be used where it could be. And we're seeing it being used at many different places. Some of them, though, as you begin to look like Elon Musk actually, in public talks and things, has said that his innovation process really has part of the beginning under the innovation process that was used here and before. So, Sharif, I think that's not a bad intro to get us started. And I'd love to hear what the others have to
Thank you.
say.
Mr. Markley, what you want to
I
share
mean,
about Nikola Tesla technology?
Tesla is definitely a major player here in the United States, and it has continued to be a major player, and will always be a major player in terms of its modern day implications and everything. Don't know as much about the history of Tesla as I would like to know, and was quite fascinated by some of the things that David was sharing, and all along those lines. So definitely it'll be a learning experience for me as well. But I do know that they are a major force and continue to be a major force, even if we explore some of the things that they are doing in automobile technology, including the self-driving car, and including some of the things that they are doing in space technology as well.
Thank you, Mr. David J. Kelly.
Sure.
Mr. David?
As,
Yeah.
can you hear me? As far as Nikola Tesla goes, I know that he really did, like David mentioned, has done some amazing work. I think one of the reasons he's not as well known is that his lack of formal training, in some cases, having to do with technical documentation around his material, his inventions. But I know, like in my son, who first started doing scientific work at 15 at the nuclear lab club that they put together. A lot of the stuff they played with was, Nikola Tesla. They learned about electricity using Tesla coils and all of this kind of stuff that Nikola Tesla did. And when it comes to inventors, he's one of the ones that's had the most impact on modern technology.
Professor David Smith, that World Talent Economy Forum, we are doing scientific research and we are uplifting Nikola Tesla Technology Conference. So many universities and scientists from around the world, they are working on these projects. So how we can improve more on different issues of Nikola Tesla, what is the advice, how emerging economy, new scientists can engage uh, more with this kind of activities.
Well, Sharif, the possibilities really are pretty endless when you look at the breadth of what he invented and what he forecast to be invented. He was not just an inventor, but he was a fairly proliferate futurist as well. And you begin to see that being used. I loved one of the quotes attributed to him. We are all one. People are interconnected by invisible forces. Although we have freedom to think and act, we stick together like stars on the heavenly arc with unbreakable connections. These connections cannot be seen, but we can feel them. And that was part of what I think you began to look at as part of his legacy that we can take and build up on today. Um, and his inventions actually had many inventions, and particularly forecasts of inventions that are very applicable for this time. There is actually a company that is kind of interesting called True Tesla Technologies, which is modeled on Nikola Tesla's legacy. And they are looking at how to create the world to be a more sustainable world in areas like waste management, recycling, and green technology, built up on the principles that were advanced by him. And you're beginning to see them. Nikola Tesla was actually, as I said before, one of the inventors of hydropowered plants and beginning to look at it. And what we're seeing is now there is beginning to be an implementation of some of his words he wrote around that time, uh, but beginning to look at how to extend them even further using today's technology. The hydropower that he had invented back in the late 1800s is very crude to what you see today, because we're now seeing some of his advances becoming wave powered power stations. We're seeing cascading power stations where they are cascading the different power across different settings, which are really very good in things like uh, pulling hydropower out of rivers as opposed to lakes, and really looking at the tidal power of seas to do that. Also, one of his other inventions that was kind of interesting was he had uh, pioneered back some of the areas of how to create a sustainable way to feed fish and capture fish to be used as food stock. And so, in some ways, he was really kind of ahead of his time as you begin to look at his application of being sustainable with what he was doing as well. Uh, and he was also, in some ways, a very brave inventor. Um, when he invented uh, uh, alternating currents, uh, he actually gave exhibits in his laboratory where he lit lamps by allowing the electricity to flow through his body. Now, I don't think I would have done that, but it was one of his ways to say, I not only believe in what I'm inventing, I really trust it, and I can believe it's going to be uh, one of the forefronts of what he's wanting to do. And, for example, Westinghouse, uh, around Niagara Falls in the United States, uh, that is where they first tested his first hydro power machinery, and it carried power to Buffalo, New York in 1896. So you can see that the impact of his inventions go back quite a while in history, and his approach to defining it was very well defined, and he was a good salesperson of his inventions. But I agree with David Kelly in that some of the challenges around him is, like many brilliant inventors, they didn't do a good job of documenting their systems. They didn't do a good job of pulling people around who can uh, take and refine and, like I said, document and set up partnerships, because folks like Nikola Tesla, they tended to go on to their next inventions, which is one of the things we see very often in today's world too, that people who love to invent very often finish what they started to invent. Or many people today who can understand, here's a solution to this problem, but they rarely invent it and carry it to market. So, Sharif, that's a little bit more on him and some of what he's done.
Hey, David, along those same lines, how much of his inventions were his
Thank you.
own inventions and everything? Because I know here in the United States, it is usually collaborators that are doing these inventions, and not saying that Mr. Tesla was not an amazing person, but I do know that a lot of times it takes teamwork, and sometimes those other inventors aren't always given the recognition that they should be given. We saw that with the Hidden Figures and a number of other things here in the United States. But I was just wondering how much of it was a team effort and how much of it was Mr. Tesla's own personal brainchild.
Well, go
David,
ahead,
do you
Dave.
want to answer that?
Well, I was just going to say that he invented a lot of the stuff he invented, but just like AC current, he's not the one that drove it home and developed it into, the way we do power across the world.
Right.
He sold his patents to Westinghouse, and Westinghouse developed it out, and made it a really practical technology.
Right.
But that being said, he did invent most of the stuff, as far as I know, that he invented. But documentation was weak, and some of this material, and he wasn't the one that was able to drive it home and get the stuff adopted, whereas others, like the team at Westinghouse, was able to take that and do something with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that y'all were talking, and this comes back to Mr. David Smith and everything that I was thinking about, was the notion of futurism and being a futurist. And I definitely know that I think of Tesla as being a true futurist and everything, but I was just wondering, for the two of you gentlemen, what do you think he would think of this modern day futurism? Because I just heard recently, I was reading an article with one of the modern day futurists that is predicting that by the year 2030, we could be slipping into immortality because of some of the things that Tesla and others invented, where there may be some of these technologies roaming through our bodies that can keep us alive and all in that space. So that was actually what a modern day futurist put out there about 2 or 3 days ago, and I can't remember what the futurist was, but apparently he's got a good track record of success. But what do you think Tesla would think about some of these futurism predictions that are being thrown out there?
Mhm. Yes.
Uh,
Mr.
Mark,
David, yes.
Mark, let me kind of answer that one. Since I am actually a professional futurist, as
Right.
certified by the bodies and stuff, and speak a lot on that one. Um, Actually, if you look at some of his other things which he forecasts, like radar, like lasers, and others like that, uh, I think he would see that a lot of the things he did, the technologies were not available back then to achieve what his vision was, what his forecast was. But I don't think he would be surprised. I believe your friend who talked about immortality by 2030 is a little ahead of themselves. Kind of like there's some futurists I love who change their forecast every other year and keep pushing it out.
Right.
Uh, I think you're going to see around 2030 enough advances in regenerative healthcare and immune therapy and gene therapy that people born around that time will live into their hundreds routinely, um, but not immortality yet. Uh, that's going to be a hard one because I don't think the world can support people with a lifespan in that length because we just won't have space and resources to support it. But it's clear that life expectancies are going to increase. But the other thing that I think, going back to Tesla on this one, is that, for example, part of his work was on wireless technology. And one of his funny little inventions was a radio frequency controlled boat to sell. And but that then led to a lot of other inventions. And I believe I agree with David Kelly. He was an inventor. He was not the person who commercialized what he's doing, which is what you see now. You also see that some of the experiments he was working on around the time of his death would have been great today. A couple of the projects which have been noted is was working on experiments around free energy. He also was looking on long range wireless energy transfer. Um, and I know of several companies who are trying to develop and commercialize the long range wireless energy transfer. And I've seen some interesting demonstrations of energy transferred wirelessly in fairly high uh, ranges from one of the companies happens to be located in Texas near Dallas, and it was being transmitted down to Puerto Rico wirelessly and powering a whole subdivision there by using theirs. And this is one of the really things that is, I think, very interesting when you look at where he began and what he invented, and some of his patents that were never commercialized. Uh, and he actually came up with the induction motor that has used globally everywhere, and that was patented way back in the early days. But then it was repatented again by the companies that were commercializing it in the late 1980s. And just it really began to go them. And some of his inventions, like the Tesla car, which is kind of interesting, it also has some uh, practical applications in radios and other things like that. But earlier this week at a outdoor concert venue set up here in Austin for South by Southwest. Um, there was a large Tesla coil system set up that was used to have the lightning between each of the different Tesla coils react to the music that was being played on stage. And I thought it was very, very interesting. And he began to use these Tesla coils and what was called Gessler tubes to use in that way to really enhance the performances that you saw that was there. The the whole thing was just very, very interesting in there, and he worked wonderfuls for people around the world, and that the technology, if the supportive technologies, the allied technologies, had been better defined uh, during his time, he would have been made even a greater impact. One of his biggest challenges was his inventions were ahead of their time. They were ahead of markets and things too, which is often one of the problems you see today going with people who are brilliant inventors, is that often it takes a while for a market to evolve, and he was just ahead of his time.
Thank
So
you.
one comment,
Mr.
if I
Mark, yeah.
may, um, with the question of whether Nikola Tesla would believe it. I think a quote or a case in point is that he's quoted as saying that he could split the earth in half and had a death ray that could shoot down 10,000 airplanes at the same time. So the chance that he would believe something crazy like, oh, immortality, we'll have that by 2030, I think it's highly likely whether it actually happens or not.
Right, I agree with you.
He was touch prone to exaggeration.
As most inventors, yeah, you're right.
Mr. Martley, you want to share anything with our audience? Are you with me? I think he is busy. Mr. David Smith.
Well, I actually love what David Kelly was talking about there, because that quote that he attributed to Tesla was made in the New York Times in 1934, and the concept of he was working with is he actually called it a peace beam, and it was to shoot ions out very high energy and at very high speed. And he wanted to use it to create a defensive wall. He actually called it an invisible Chinese wall for every nation. Um, and he used it by using multiple of his tried to create using multiple of his technologies at the same time, such as he created a, high velocity air vacuum chamber using his Tesla turbine, and it really kept it open to where it could harness the energy to produce the beam. It all sounded really great, but he never produced a prototype. And he actually is quoted as saying he sees the promise, but he was at loss to see how to carry it out with the technology they had at the time. But that same approach there is what led to him beginning to put the basis in place for the laser, which is changed many more things than you might think. Lasers are how we get the very high bandwidths today using optical lasers as part of the process, and how we began to do the other things. But David Kelly, I think it's very interesting is that uh, we see today many of the governments are beginning to go back and relook at his thoughts of his peace ray back then. And even though it's there, uh, it really is something that I think we're going to see more and more come out in the future, that parts of inventions and technologies were there. The Department of Defense actually acknowledges back under the President Reagan's Star Wars defense initiative that they were using some of the ideas from Nikola Tesla as we began to see how that can be populated and put forward. So you really see that it's being done in a lot of different ways. And I love his way he began to do it. And a and he actually had a sense of humor. When he passed away, he had a invention in his hotel room that was opened a few days later, where they sent over a physicist to examine his papers and what was there. And this package had a note written in Tesla's handwriting that said contained a prototype, and it would detonate if opened incorrectly. And what's very fun with it is they did go ahead and open it, and it was a piece of common technology that is one which I know surprised everyone, but it is true. He had a sense of humor even going along with his inventions, and you see that when he made things like his uh, discovery and invention of um, resonated waves, terrestrial stationary resonant waves, which is the basis to not only some of our broadcasting capabilities, but the ability to do precise measurements using uh, electronic means as opposed to physical means. So Nikola Tesla's impact was tremendous as you look across and around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Martley, as you are from media, so do you believe media should promote this kind of story to inspire our new generation?
Oh yeah, I mean that's one of the things that is not being done enough is the media isn't promoting a lot of the unsung heroes and getting the word out. A lot of times they are even unsung heroes right here where I'm at that are not being covered because they are too busy oftentimes covering the things that are the sensational, whether that's the sensational in politics or the sensational around crime and a number of other things that are in that space. But there are tons of unsung heroes that are historical, like Mr. Tesla, and definitely there are other ones that are even being unsung to this day. I mean, I'm sure that David, who is over there in California, can probably go over to some of the Silicon Valley places and see many folks that are doing inventions that would be comparable to what Tesla did, but are not getting the kind of notice and accolades that they should get. And I'm right around the corner from what we call the Research Triangle Park, and I can say that there are people that are doing that kind of work that are not getting noticed. And unfortunately, our mainstream media does oftentimes ignores the scientists of the world. The scientists and the artists don't always get the respect that they deserve, and sometimes it's not until after they pass that they get that respect. So yes, I definitely think that we can do a better job of covering some of these stories, both from those that are historical, like Mr. Tesla, as well as those that are doing some of the modern things, even to this day and going forward and everything. Because a lot of the inventions that are taking place need to be covered and need to be reported on, and definitely we should be honoring those. But I also don't think that our school systems do a great job of honoring them either. But I don't know if David Smith and David Kelly would agree with what I've been saying, but I do get frustrated by our media outlets, be they specialized media outlets and or our mainstream media, because unfortunately I don't even think that our science magazines, and there are science magazines out there and other kinds of specialized media, do a good enough job of covering these historical legends and all in that space. But David Smith and David Kelly, what are y'all's thoughts?
Mhm. Mr. David Kelly.
Well, in terms of our education system, at least in the United States, I would argue that it's borderline incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
They focus on all this other stuff that's not relevant to math and science, and it just, the kind of students I see come in looking for a job are usually a waste of time for me to even interview. And I blame the education system and our kind of where we've allowed kids to go with modern technology. But in terms of the media, it mass media, for the most part, I mean, I've just gotten to the point where I ignore them. They just don't even carry stuff that, it's all sensationalized nonsense, usually, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to come back and ask, what are your thoughts? And this is about both of you, Kelly and Smith. But what are your thoughts around the fact that there has been a push, and I think a needed push, to get more people involved in? It's got different names. I've heard everything from STEM to STEAM to HEAL, depending on which one of the elements you want to add. But it is all science based, and I know that actually tomorrow I'll be going to a cultural arts center that I work at, and they'll actually be teaching the kids about coding. So I'll actually be teaching the kids about coding. And my good friend Renee Daughtry, who is a Cisco engineer, is one of those folks that is getting these kids into coding and learning about robots and drones, and even some of the history of some of the folks that invented some of the things that we use regularly that we don't always know who those inventors were, because there was definitely an African American gentleman that was one of the creators of Archie, which was the precursor to the whole search engines and all in that space. And a lot of times folks don't realize that until people talk about his role in that, and then the young lady's role, whose name, both of their names are suddenly, that was involved in the creation of the GPS, which we all know that we use on a regular basis. But I was just wondering your thoughts as to, is this something that is positive that's on the education system? Because people talking about STEM, HEAL, whichever gives, I think that's got health in it, or some other kind of things in that space.
I think STEM programs are great. The problem is they don't do enough of them in schools. A lot of these after school programs do an amazing job. Absolutely amazing. The public schools, however, I think it's pitiful.
Yeah. I would agree with you. It's pitiful. And like you said, a lot of it is after schools, and a lot of it is folks that were in the fields. Like I said, the gentleman that I referenced, Renee Daughtry, is a longtime Cisco engineer. So he's the one that created that program. And I know some others that are in those kind of spaces too, but they created them as after school or weekend type programs.
And Mark, the two that you mentioned, in STEAM, the A stands for arts.
Right.
And I think STEAM is actually an appropriate approach to use that, because we often forget that the creative process, the ability to be not only in the box but out of the box, as you begin to innovate and discover, and much like what Nikola Tesla did, is he was as much of a artist as he was an electrical engineer. When you begin to look at it, and some of his drawings and things, as he began to work through his ideas, are almost true pieces of art, as you see what he's done. And he wrote hundreds of lab notebooks to kind of flesh out his ideas, and some of his best ideas were never executed upon, as we see over the years. And the fact that people still to this day are going back and looking at his notebooks in Europe and stuff are a testament to how far he is ahead of himself. But your earlier question, actually one of the first questions you asked, Mark, was very insightful, because you begin to see things like Tesla did not invent artificial lights, but he's responsible for the concept of the fluorescent bulbs that went forward. And at a World's Fair, he used glass tubes by customizing into names of famous scientists to create neon signs, is one of the ways he began to try to put the whole concept of fluorescent tubes and neon tubes to work. And so he took some of his physics, some of his electrical engineering, his Tesla coils, his stationary wave inventions, and he took those and combined them to begin to do the things like neon lighting coils and fluorescent tubes that advanced really some of the things that we depend on today as we look at. The other one that I really thought was there is he spent a lot of time not just in looking at radio and electromagnetic technologies. He began to look at some other ionizing type of things, and he created something called a shadow box. And the shadow box is really what became our modern day X-rays. And it came from his belief that everything we need is around us at all the time. And he began to use this with his inventions and studying he did in trying to enhance photography. And then the shadow box, he saw that he could actually see the bones in his hand and his arms as he was trying to enhance the photography process of the day. And so again, it's not that the technology's there, it's not that the just the invention, but he used his own concept of trying to gain intelligence from all the things around us. Mark, I talk often on Sharif's broadcast about group intelligence, and he was a practitioner of group intelligence. And his big thing is he would work and look around him and see what's there. And he goes, how can I do it a different way? How can I enhance it? How can I make it more practical, particularly at a longer range? One of the fascinations during his lifetime was he wanted to do things that could be applicable miles and miles away from him. So one of his first experiments with wireless transmission of power, he lit light bulbs at a state fair that was 25 miles from his laboratory. And we can we do that today? Yes. Do we do it routinely? No. So even then, you begin to see some of the brilliance of his concepts. And his biggest problem is throughout his life, he never really made much monetary gain from any of his inventions. He never had enough money to go and take his inventions to commercialization. And I mean, he died in debt from the number of loans he had taken out during his lifetime to try to develop his science. And that was one of the things which I think held back a greater recognition that you saw others after him. For example, if you compare him to Einstein, and Einstein has said publicly that he studied all of Tesla's papers and they helped influence some of his thought. But Einstein had funding from governments and corporations and things during most of his lifetime, where Tesla did not.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I was reading an article recently. It was actually one of our American inventors, and that's actually where I was going with that other question earlier, because sometimes the ones that do the hardcore work don't always get the background and everything. Because it was actually an article that I was reading about Thomas Edison, and it was about how many people had actually been involved in the creation of the light bulb before Thomas Edison was even in the picture and everything. But of course, from our education standpoint, to David Kelly's point, that it is oftentimes the ones that are glorified that aren't always the ones that actually did the hardcore work. There were a lot of people that were doing the work before that we never hear about, and all in that space. And that was one of the articles I was reading, and I'm sure the same can be said around Alexander Graham Bell and some of the other ones that are given the credit, but there are others that were doing the way before them, even in the case of like Ben Franklin and those that are here in America that get a lot of those accolades when there were people that were doing it decades, if not centuries beforehand.
Mr. David J. Kelly, you want to add any point with Sir David?
Well, No, I mean, I agree with most of that. Maybe except for the part about art. I think STEM should be focused on mathematics and science, and I'd like to see less art programs in schools. As much as I think design is part of what will make or break companies in the future, I think we focus, in my experience, public schools focus too much on programs that don't really help students, and that includes most art programs and theater and things like that just are not contributory. You're not contributing to science and mathematics, which is what I think is important.
But along those same lines, what would you say to those? Because I'm going to actually disagree with you slightly. That would argue and could very adequately argue, probably even better than I can, that art and art education, if done correctly, and I would agree with you that a lot of it is not done correctly, is actually very much important in the development of critical thinking. And we know that many people are not that good at critical thinking and all in that space.
Shouldn't that be taught in critical thinking classes and logic classes and mathematics?
But I mean, can't art be the avenue to get to that kind of educations and everything? Because a lot
That
of
seems kind of
critical thinking is actually developed through the arts. And I know some people that are master musicians that are also very good at using their tempo and the different other mathematical concepts to deal with their music. Many musicians that I know, and I know quite a few musicians, are very much adapt at their math skills. So definitely that is a example where math and music are actually interrelated.
So I wasn't going to turn my camera on because there's kind of a mess on my floor behind me. But just to preface my point, I was a professional musician and have 14 years of classical music. And in fact, my clarinet is right here. And if you want, I can play it. But that notwithstanding, I really think, and I think to concede one point, it really depends on how it's framed and how you're using it and how effective a particular program is. But, I would really like to see a much harder academic competitive focus where students that aren't able to compete are kicked out or sent to vocational schools, and it's hard focus on math, science, precision, logic, and all the like. Don't get me wrong, music in particular is a way of mathematically breaking down emotional communication. I'll give you that. But you can't convince me that finger painting or oil painting has the same correlation as music.
My dad is actually a master artist. Go check out bambooturtle.com. He uses a lot of art, but he is also scientifically trained. So that's where I would argue with you.
But what does the painting have to do with rocket science? I mean, what's important?
Well, David, you asked a great question there on rocket science. Actually, if you look at some of the early manual design of rockets nozzles before we were able to use computers to simulate them, they were done using painting drawings to begin to look at the interactions and how colors flowed and things to each other. And if you go back to the people who invented the rocket nozzle, that type of painting is attributed as part of their inspirations to get there. But on the other hand, I agree with you. Our science, our math programs are not well suited in the public schools today.
No, I definitely agree with you.
I
definitely agree with him that the sciences need to be greater used and everything. But I would also argue that what is one of the greatest artist fields of all that many people admire? Is it not architecture? And is not architecture a form of art?
I wouldn't teach also a form of science in high school either, though.
Huh?
I said I wouldn't teach architecture in high school either, though.
You would not teach architecture in high school? Then
not till we master mathematics and science, other hard sciences.
I
We
mean, what
can't
would you?
we can't even teach. I mean, they do, like some of these schools, they do soft grading. They try to teach it to be fair to everyone. No, it's about competition and crushing your opponent. I mean, when you get into business, no one is giving you a participation award,
No, I'm
right?
agreeing.
It's capitalism, making money, and people need to learn that in these hard sciences. And
Either
all
No,
this
that or we need
mumbo
to
jumbo,
either
I
that
just
we need to make our sports programs more competitive then to teach
Mhm.
those same skills in there,
I would be that would
or do we really need to go back and redo the curriculum, which I think we need to do,
Right.
to make it more interdisciplinary across all the fields so
that's true.
that science, technology is applied in most of things. The problem with most of the science courses today in middle school and high school, David, in my opinion, is they look out the rearview mirror and tell you what happened in the past, but they don't tell you what to do with it today, how to apply it, how to look out the windshield. And that's where the art
I
comes in
agree.
my opinion.
I
Is the
agree.
art
And
says take what they've told you retrospectively, use your imagination today and look out your windshield beyond your headlights and do stuff with it. And uh, I'm violently in agreement with you about the state of science and technology education today. But
Mhm.
I'm also very, very strong that I think the creative elements represented by the arts has to be part of that. And whether it's taught in an art class or is it integrated into the curriculum with the others, I think it's a necessary element because that's where the spark of innovation comes from is your creative self.
I
And I
would
would,
concede that if we have, by all means, the curriculum, we need to start over. But I would absolutely agree and concede that it should be a cross-disciplinary approach. And if you can use art and creative thinking to teach hard science and stuff like that, I am 100% for it. That would be way better than what we're doing now. And you're right, cross-disciplinary thinking in particular is a big key to innovation across the board. And I absolutely agree with that sentiment.
no,
I
and
just
I hear what you're saying, David, and I agree with you that, but I would say that you can use art to teach science. And like I said, I would use my dad, who was actually a media
yeah.
person, but he has definitely used art to teach a bunch. And if y'all go to his website and anybody that's listening, I would urge them to go to bambooturtle.com. You'll see that he uses everything from dead insects and a number of other scientific principles to teach about art. And he is actually a well-known regional artist here in this area and retired at the age of 80 from being a professor in the media. So he was a professor in the media before, but his dad was the biologist that Central's biology department, North Carolina Central University's biology department is named after. So he grew up with a love of science, but also a love of the arts as well. So I think that the two can be very much integrated. And I would say that I have a strong background and a strong love of the arts, but I also have a strong respect of the science. I'm not going to say that I was
No,
ever I just
you're
in my
right. They can be integrated, and if they would do that more, I would be totally down with that.
yeah.
It's
And Dave, let me give you a good example. And this is in my misguided youth. So this was decades and decades ago, before computers really came out there. In my misguided youth, I was a roadie.
I don't
And
know what that is.
I ran audio for some of the big bands that were on tour.
Right.
Okay,
And when we would go into some places, new places, particularly back then, we didn't have computers to do simulations to say where could we put speakers in a place. So what I did back then is I always took clay with me on tours like that, and we'd build a quick clay outline of the venue we were in, put water in it, and then where we planned to put the speakers, we'd create waves from there to see how the waves interact. Water waves are just like sound waves. And so we were using basically art there as an engineering function, well ahead of computers, how we would do it today, to
I,
begin to solve
I would
physical.
argue that wasn't art. You were doing science there. You were You were
Oh, we were
actually
doing both. We
creating
were
a
applying them
model.
all. We were synthesizing them all together, David. And
That's
that's the
brilliant.
point here, is that you have to synthesize these together to be innovative. And
Agreed. I agree.
I mean, people laughed at me when they saw I had clay in my thing and I built the model at the inside of the facility in it. But then when they saw the results, they went, God, this is good. How did you do this? And that's the part of putting pieces together. And that's what Nikola Tesla did really well, is he took things like that and he learned from it. He experimented with different types of approaches, and he learned from his. I think if you look at his background, and it's a concept that became known well after him called design of experiments. I think one of his strengths, even though he didn't talk about it a lot, but in his lab books, was his design of experiments, which put all those various elements together and which gave him the ability to be such an innovator that he was.
Okay.
Okay. Excellent. This is very good discussion, especially for our audience. Mr. Mike, you
Yeah,
want
no
to add
doubt.
any point as a concluding remarks for today?
No, along those same lines, and I don't know what David's thoughts about this are, but definitely I would say that there have to be other things, meaning Mr. Kelly, that have to be taught as well. Because I know here in North Carolina, they are actually thinking about, which I think is a good idea, but some people may be upset about it, but they are thinking about adding a requirement that folks understand civics here in North Carolina, because there was already some stuff around financial literacy, but they're actually asking them to understand civics, because I don't know how it is over there where David Smith is or where you are, Kelly, but there are people around here that don't even know what the Gettysburg Address is, and they think that Judge Judy is on the Supreme Court. So that is why one of the reasons that they want to make it mandatory that it be a requirement for you to graduate from college. So Dr. Sharif, if you're going to come over here to college to go to Duke or North Carolina State, you might also have to learn civics as well, because they're going to require that you know civics, whether you're coming from overseas or coming from here in the United States. But that is something that North Carolina is strongly considering under the current Republican legislatures and all in that space. But it'll be interesting to see how that
Mark,
plays out.
that has been a requirement here in Texas for 60 years.
For the colleges and the community colleges, I know it's a requirement on the high
Well, for the
school.
community colleges and for the high schools.
Okay. They're thinking about making it a requirement for the colleges
Okay.
and the community colleges here in North Carolina. I think it was already required on the high schools.
So these are great things. And Dr. Sharif, this to me is an example of how developing nations need to look at how to work together in the future. Because what we've heard of the discussion is all these elements have to come together. And too often, particularly early stage entrepreneurs, particularly are going, I can't do it because I don't have all the technology at hand. Nikola Tesla was one who didn't worry about the technology at hand. He didn't have to have all of the latest, greatest things there on hand. And remember, he did this all before the computer was invented, to be able to have a lasting impact on society. And I think that his approaches and how he did this is a great lesson for people in developing nations who want to pull together and make an impact on the world and to be able to better themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Just to look at some of the processes he did, what was behind him, how he created things that were different at times. When he invented the alternating current, Edison wanted to kill the idea because Edison believed that all the current should be direct current. And he went to great lengths to try to kill alternating current with Tesla. But the superior technology for the time came out. Now, are the benefits direct current? Yes. But it didn't transmit as far and as well at the time. Um, but like I said, his legacy is a great lesson for the developing nations that we have today.
Hey, David and David Kelly, I have an interesting question, and I know we're wrapping up and everything, but I've been having an interesting conversation with a dear friend of mine. This dear friend of mine is actually involved in the metaverse space and involved in the computer virtual reality, augmented reality space, and all in that line. They have developed some amazing artwork. As a matter of fact, they're doing a Shamrock collection that is NFT based and everything, because this will be in St. Patrick's Day and all along those lines. And one of the conversations we've been having is whether she is an artist or not, because I actually consider her an artist, and she's like that. One of the feedback that she gets is that it is computer generated artists, where some of the other artists are doing more of the drawing art. But I'm like, it still has to come from your mind, and even if it's being generated by the computer, in my mind, it is still some art, and it's still some very amazing art. So Nicole Maxwell, I would definitely say, has done some great art, but there are some people that are more traditional that might say that that is not actual art and all in that space. But I don't know what your gentleman's thoughts are, but I'm like, if it's creative and it looks like art, it must be art. But that's just my attitude. But I don't know whether y'all would agree or not, because it is being computer generated. It has to come from her mind and her thoughts, but the actual imagery, a lot of it is generated by the computer.
Thank you. Mr. David
David
Kelly,
Kelly,
what's your
David
concluding
got
remarks?
the answer. You're still not coming through, David. You're coming through earlier. I'm not hearing you at all.
From my side, let me just get my concluding remarks out because I do need to jump off. And I kind of said most of it the last time. I think if you look at Nikola Tesla and his technologies, uh, both the ones that he built prototypes over, ones that he let others commercialize, and ones that he just forecasted and wrote about. He was clearly ahead of his time. He has taught us lessons that we can apply very broadly. And, I think as you go back and look at some of his writings, we're seeing things that are just now coming to fruition today, years and years after his death. It's been it's been over 75 years since he died, and we're seeing his inventions today coming out and being proven through the science and technology that we can apply today. I actually believe, much like David Kelly does, that we need to redo our school systems uh, on how we look at science, how we look at technology, how we look at the concepts of invention, how we look at creativity, how we look at business. And all of these have to come together, I believe, multidisciplinary, so that we understand today that most innovations today work in multiple verticals. And it takes multiple sciences and technologies to make them work. And I believe Tesla was ahead of his time as he began to look at this. And so, Dr. Shree, I really want to thank you. Your topic today, I think, is one, in the conference coming up uh, on this in July, I believe is going to be a fantastic conference to begin to look at how this all can be applied and used.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. Mr. David J. Kelly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I just want to say, responding to the question about being an artist, I would argue that some mathematicians are artists.
I would too.
So, if they're making art and using a computer to do it, the computer is just a fancy paintbrush. It who's to say one tool is better than the other when it comes to something as subjective as art? And then, gosh, there was something else I was going to say, but I forgot what it was. Oh, about civics. Oh, for heaven's sakes. That reminds me, there was like the Jay Leno show or something where they went around to college.
We lost your audio, David.
So, David, can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you now. Yes.
Yeah, my computer was apparently, I don't know, it's having hard time with this fancy mic here,
Right.
and it's muting me. I was just saying, if you go back and look at like these, like where it was a segment on the Jay Leno show where they would interview college students, and people would think like Florida is a state, or sorry, Florida is like a country in South America kind of thing. It's just really sad. I would almost argue that civics should be a requirement to get into high school. Just basic geography and geopolitics, to don't be completely clueless. You know, yeah, I'm all for that being a requirement.
Mhm. Thank you, everyone. This is very, very important session for us. World Talent Economy Forum in July, we are organizing a conference with European Innovation Alliance in Dhaka. It will be both in online and offline, so anybody can join. And second things, if you have a research paper on Nikola Tesla different issues, you can submit, and we're going to publish it. So thank you, Mr. Mark Lee, and thank you, Mr. David J. Kelly and Mr. David Smith, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Bye bye, guys.